Let's go! Here we go again. This is Professor Tatum here with yet another lecture for History 1302. Today we're looking at pushes for progressivism. In this lecture, we'll be looking at grassroots progressivism, meaning progressivism practiced by individuals outside of mainstream electoral politics. We're looking at individuals, organizations at the grassroots level in this period known as the Progressive Era. As always, we'll see a bit of context, then we'll examine some of the progressives' goals and reforms, also look at some of their major legal achievements. We will also identify and examine characteristics of some progressives of color, and we will also define progressivism in the progressive era. That's kind of our main goal with this lecture, as we'll see moving forward, is to identify what the heck does this even mean? One thing we need to understand going into this lecture is there's a good deal of overlap between the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. Rebecca Edwards, toward the end of the introduction you guys read, suggests that perhaps we're limiting ourselves a bit by using this metaphor of a Gilded Age, and that's not really the only way we can look at that period, right? That perhaps we could use other metaphors to look at this same period in a different way. And one that she suggests is perhaps we could look at it as the early Progressive Era. Because as we'll see, a lot of the issues that these people called the progressives in this era, which is usually seen as separate from the Gilded Age, really started a lot of what they were doing during the Gilded Age. All right. So by the late 1800s, a lot of actions of people who would later be considered progressives were already starting to take off. We'll also see that what a lot of progressives are advocating are responses to problems that are occurring largely as a result of a lot of the changes occurring throughout the Gilded Age, things like industrialization, urbanization, etc. The term progressive to describe people in the sense that we understand progressives in the progressive era would not really start to be used commonly until the 1910s, but the spirit of the progressive era and a lot of the actions and individuals related to this progressive era were already taken off very heavily by the Gilded Age. All right. So the progressive era, in the same sense of the Gilded Age, doesn't necessarily have a defined time period. Different historians place it in different particular years, that it mainly occurred in the later years of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, going a little past the Gilded Age. So we can understand this from occurring from late 1800s up to the end of World War I. And it's very important as we go into this lecture and try to understand what progressivism meant in the progressive era and what it meant to be a progressive in the progressive era, to throw any 21st century ideas we may have of those terms out the window. A lot of people have all kinds of biases about what that means and automatically get defensive or offensive, either in favor of or against this idea of progressivism and what it means to be progressive. And a lot of that does not apply at all here. Okay, we'll see that there's actually pretty particular meaning for what it means to be progressive in this period, and both individuals of the political left and political right fit within this type of progressivism. So, really, when we're looking at the progressives, as some experts, such as those you saw here in your reading from Link and McCormick, will suggest that there is no single answer to that question, right? There are several diverse groups of Americans, men and women. Some are pushing for religion, some are pushing for science, some are more conservative, while others are more liberal. There are progressives in both the Democratic and Republican Party. They're kind of all over the place, right? And that's how Lincoln McCormick described it. But I'm going to suggest that there does seem to be some kind of common thread that unites progressives in the progressive era. All right. So what I want us to be thinking about as we go through this lecture is, where are we seeing commonalities? We're going to see all different kinds of stuff all over the place, different types of people with different types of causes. But what is that common thread that makes them all a progressive in this progressive era? So, in other words, what does it mean to be a progressive in the progressive era? We'll see the progressives had common tactics. They did use various types of political and social organizations. They frequently resulted to things like marching, political lobbying. We'll see that other progressives use things like journalism and photography to draw attention to public issues and try to push for changes to those issues. All right. We call those individuals muckrakers. All right. So this term muckrakers refers to investigative journalists who draw attention to problems that they recognize within society to try to bring change to those problems, right? To try to inspire people to recognize these problems and do something about them. They want people, in most cases, to call upon government to address this problem, right? Or to act democratically as members of a democratic society in which people are the primary means of government to work together to address these problems. Okay, so we can see that one clear issue of a lot of progressives came down to regulating business. Remember, during the Gilded Age, business was kind of running rampant and taking advantage of people in all kinds of different ways. Well, one muckraker in particular, a guy named Upton Sinclair, tried drawing attention to this by writing a book called The Jungle. Now, you guys have seen a little bit about The Jungle by now. This was a fictional book, but it did, of course, aim to draw attention to the conditions that American workers were facing in the meatpacking factories of industrial America during the Gilded Age. Now, of course, his key goal was to expose the conditions that workers faced in these industries, showing that, for example, they had to show up to work real early and stand around in a meat cooler, waiting around for something to do. And if they were a minute late, they were frequently laid off. Yet there was often not a lot of work for them to do until later in the day. And all that time that they're standing around freezing their off, they're not getting paid, right? Pretty harsh conditions for workers there. But as Sinclair suggested, while he aimed at the public's heart, trying to get sympathy for American workers, he hit them in the stomach. Because also throughout The Jungle, he described the types of conditions going into people's foods. Now, I've included this GIF here from The Sopranos, which for whatever reason is not working here. Give me a second. But this is from a scene in The Sopranos, which is one of the greatest shows known to mankind, right up there with SpongeBob SquarePants. Up to about season 3 or so. After that, I don't know what the hell happened to SpongeBob, but I digress. But in this scene here, these two mobsters are grinding up this dude with a sausage grinder in their sausage factory. And one of them saying, "It's going to be a good while before I can eat anything from here." And that's not far off from what Upton Sinclair found, right? He found little fingernails, fingertips, hair, all kinds of nasty stuff in the food, right? The sausage, don't even get me started. Sometimes I do like some mustard with my sausage, but not mouse turds like they had going into the sausage here. By the way, while we're going to see that there were some regulations that came out of this, please don't be under the assumption that we eat perfectly clean, healthy food now in the 21st century. Do a little research and you'll see we still eat some pretty nasty stuff, just not quite as bad as we saw here, where, okay, they have graying meat or rotten meat, so they're just going to put a little food dye and coloring and maybe a little paint in it to get it to the color they want where they can sell it. But the public was outraged by the conditions of the food they were eating, and people began pushing for reform in terms of regulating food and what was being sold to consumers to eat on the market. This led to a series of laws. What I really want us to understand most, establishing the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, which of course regulates food and drug quality. We also need to understand, though, the FDA, in addition to being very relevant in terms of the nasty food conditions we saw, was also very helpful in terms of regulating things like medicine, because up to this period there had been no regulations on what had been advertised, what had been put into medicines, and things like that. So here people were selling things like cocaine tooth drops, taking a lot of mercury pills to try to cure headaches and things like that. So the FDA is trying to come in and regulate all of this, largely in response to Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. All right, so please note, we're seeing here something that The Jungle led to. That sounds pretty important, doesn't it? You should probably write that down. Sounds pretty significant. Another place we can see an example of progressives trying to regulate business is in response to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. All right, so during this fire, we need to understand that the owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Company had a history of mysterious fires breaking out in businesses they owned, and then they'd go collect a nice hefty insurance claim after the fires broke out. And strangely enough, a fire broke out in their factory on the 8th floor of this building. And as you saw, this was total pandemonium, okay? There was no regulation in the workplace in terms of fire safety, so there was no real plan. As people went to the fire escapes, they found that they were rusted and crumbled and not kept up with. The fire department's hoses were rotting and falling apart as they were trying to put out this fire. Their fire ladders could not reach all the way up to the 8th floor. And very, very unfortunately, a lot of these workers found that the exit was locked. As we've seen before, it was not uncommon throughout the Gilded Age for employers to lock their doors for a few reasons, whether it was to keep workers on task, making sure they're not taking breaks when they don't want them to, or to prevent theft, or in many cases to prevent union organizers from coming in and rallying up their workers. Employers would just lock doors. But if the employers had taken off to try to save their own skin, and here this factory is burning down and the door's locked, that means the workers are just trapped in there, right? Some of them even tried taking the freight elevator, but the freight elevator was out of order. This place was just not kept up with. Okay, there was no regulations or plans set in place to help them in this horrible condition. This catastrophic fire ultimately led to the death of somewhere around 150 workers, many of whom were younger immigrant women. And to escape the pressure of having to burn or suffocate in that fire, several of these workers found it a better solution to just jump from the window to their death. And I know most of you are probably too young to remember September 11th, 2001, but I was 10 years old at that time. And I witnessed everything that happened on that day. A lot of it I witnessed on live TV at 10 years old. Let me tell you, that will certainly have a lasting impact on an individual to watch a human being make that decision to jump from a burning building because they think it's better for themselves to die by falling to their death than it is to either burn or suffocate. That will mess with your head at 10 years old and stick with you for the rest of your life, I promise. And just imagine not only all the people who had to witness this happening on this day, but those poor workers who had to make that decision in their final moments that their best option was to jump to their deaths rather than to burn or to suffocate. This is just absolutely tragic, okay? And as you might imagine, it had long-term impacts on survivors, okay? So one survivor's account that one of your classmates read for their presentation showed that one worker, for example, kind of just faced struggles every year on the anniversary of the event. I believe her son's birthday was also on that same day, and she always wanted to give him the best day she could, but it was just always very difficult for her on that day because very understandably, I think she would kind of relive a lot of this in her head. That's a lot for a person to carry throughout their lives. So the owners of the factory were not positive what role they may or may not have played in this, but it is clear, of course, they had the door locked. They didn't have any plan in place for their workers to escape a dangerous condition like this. They didn't really seem to do much to try to help their workers, and they were charged with manslaughter, but they were eventually acquitted. And they were given insurance payments for each life of a worker lost. Okay, that far exceeded $75, yet they sent $75 to each victim's family to make up for the loss of their life. All right, so let's process that. They're earning far more than $75 per life lost, but they're only sending the family members $75. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if I had a family member who died, at least in part due to the negligence of their employer, and their employer had the nerve to send me $75 to try to justify what had happened or try to make amends for what happened, I would send them back that $75 and a note about what they could do with it and where they could shove it. All right, as you might imagine, a lot of people were very upset about this fire. And we need to remember this is just one example of several similar workplace tragedies occurring throughout this period due to a lack of regulation. So many progressives began calling on government to make changes, and they began calling on the members of their democratic society to work together to push for changes here in the workplace. They wanted to see regulations put in place to help prevent these types of tragedies from growing so out of hand and getting to this level. And as a result, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and the progressive response to it led to extensive workplace safety regulations. All right, for example, the Sullivan-Hoey Fire Prevention Law, which calls for things like having regular routine maintenance to fire hoses and fire extinguishers. All right, and it's from this that we started getting things like fire exits and having planned evacuation routes for if there is a fire, and having to have fire drills in some cases and things like that. Largely a result of the response of progressives to this Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. All right, so we see a couple progressives here pushing for regulation of business, two kind of very different cases. But what they're doing here is they're recognizing a problem with business and a lack of regulations, and they're calling on not only their fellow members of a democratic society, but also on the government within their democratic society to address this issue through reforms, right? By doing things like establishing the FDA or by establishing fire safety regulations in the workplace. Okay, so working together to push on for government to regulate business. All right. Another key issue that some other progressives were concerned with was combating political corruption. A great example here would be another muckraker, a guy named Lincoln Steffens, who wrote a book called Shame of the Cities. This book exposed the extent of political corruption in urban America and demonstrated how political party bosses and businessmen were dominating American cities through bribery and fraud, largely at the public's expense. So remember things like Tammany Hall and the Tweed Ring during this period we saw, where local politicians largely were taking advantage of the taxpayer and using their money for very shady purposes to benefit themselves and their friends. Those are the kinds of things that Lincoln Steffens exposed here in this book, The Shame of the Cities. And this did successfully lead to several reforms politically starting at the local level, right? Starting by doing things like replacing political bosses and political machines with city councils and city managers. But it also led to several reforms that started at the at the local level and moved on to the state and federal level as well, including things like secret ballots for elections. If you've ever gone to vote, there's always some person, usually an older lady, running around telling everybody, "Shh, stay off your phones," which for people in this period could be very essential, especially when there's so much influence from business and local elections. Well, if your boss is heavily invested in one political candidate, maybe his brother-in-law is even running for whatever office you're voting for, who knows, and he finds out you vote for the guy he doesn't want you to, that could lead you to some real problems at work, right? That's one small example of all kinds of problems that came out of there being a lack of a secret ballot. So now that's something that's gone beyond the local level. That's something that has become kind of given in American society since this is that right of a secret ballot. Also, a lot of pushes for more civil service reform to try to reduce things like the spoils system and political patronage, which we saw played a very heavy role in the assassination of President Garfield, right? So while he's taken on a different issue than those who were concerned with regulating business, we see that they kind of do have some relation in the sense that they're recognizing a problem in society, they're drawing awareness to that problem, and they're viewing government as an institution that should be involved with solving this problem by passing some kinds of laws or implementing some types of reforms. Another way in which progressives advocated improving urban living conditions was through the settlement house movement, which was really launched by Jane Addams and her settlement house, the Whole House. So Jane Addams was a middle class woman during the progressive era. And that's something I think we do need to understand is a lot of progressives were middle class because as members of the middle class, they had a little money and a little more time to get invested in solving these issues, whereas more lower class Americans were a little too busy trying to survive these issues. It was usually the middle class who was able to recognize them and start pushing for these types of reforms. Okay. But Jane Addams is a middle class woman who began to argue that as members of a democratic society, Americans should be more involved with social affairs than they had been before, suggesting that there's kind of a responsibility of members within a democratic society to provide social care for one another and to help provide services for the disadvantaged. So she established this settlement house, which kind of kicked off an entire settlement house movement where similar types of houses would follow suit. And what these settlement houses aimed to do was neighboring with the poor, as Adams said, meaning they would establish themselves in poorer communities and provide an array of services to the individuals within those communities. All right. These largely catered to immigrants as well as other families of the urban poor. And the house kind of served as a base of operations where there were shared social spaces and different classes and things like that. But they also provided an array of services throughout communities. They provided things like healthcare and education, a lot of things like kindergartens, even helped provide in some cases things like legal aid for members of poor and primarily immigrant communities. Now, notice she's not necessarily considering this a form of charity. She's not saying that we're just giving to others, we're living among them. In a way, they're kind of leading by example, showing them this is how successful white middle class people live. Is this kind of how you should live too? All right. And while it is very honorable that these services are being provided to the urban poor, this is based in part on ideas like social Darwinism and the white man's burden. We need to understand that many progressives during this period began advocating this idea of the American melting pot. This is a largely misunderstood analogy, all right? I know a lot of us in the 21st century think of the melting pot as this place where we all have a place and it's nice and equal. That's not necessarily how people in the late 1800s and early 1900s understood this concept of a melting pot, right? They saw a melting pot like a melting pot for steel, which aimed to burn out any impurities within steel to create a nice uniform type of steel. And that's how they saw the American melting pot. So, in a similar fashion to people like Captain Richard Pratt wanting to kill the Indian and save the man by washing away the elements of their culture that he found not quite as quote unquote civilized, here we see individuals through movements like the Settlement House trying to show these poor people who they see as perhaps less fit than them how to properly live, perhaps showing them how they can adopt certain elements of white middle class culture that will make them more acceptable and, in other words, more fit to survive in American society. All right, so this is going to lead to some kind of complications in this idea of progressivism. Primarily, what we've seen so far are very positive things. I'd argue, even in the Settlement House, while they may have some questionable ideas backing some of it, they are providing positive services and experiences to many of the urban poor and began pushing for other types of reforms later in their existence. But we need to understand there is not only positive elements to progressivism. People pushing for things like Jim Crow laws and eugenics laws would also be considered progressives in the progressive era. So let's think about what we've seen so far before we get into this, because this is really going to throw a wrench into things. We've seen people pushing for an array of issues, right? We've seen some people pushing for improving business. We've seen some people pushing for political reform. We've seen some people pushing for improving the conditions of urban America and urban workers. And in each of those cases, there's been individuals who are calling on members of their democratic society, as well as on government, to push for reform to address these issues that they recognize in society. Now, here as we look into things like eugenics, we can keep this in mind as well with Jim Crow laws, which also existed in this period. If we're using empathy, not sympathy, okay, we do not have to agree with this by any means. In fact, I really hope y'all don't. But through the point of view of individuals promoting these types of laws, they recognize what they perceive to be a problem in society. Okay. In the case of Jim Crow laws, for example, we can consider individuals see something like racial integration as a problem. And so they call on government to pass a series of laws to restrict certain elements of that problem. Here we see individuals promoting eugenics laws largely as a result of beliefs in things like social Darwinism. There are certain factors that people saw with individuals in society that would promote the spread of genes that were considered unfit by these certain people's terms. All right. So, in a way, we can look at eugenics as a kind of selective breeding of human beings to try to weed out undesired traits. Now, those different types of traits that could make a person considered unfit could be something as ridiculous as the shape of their head or their face. But this could also be things like physical handicaps, things like blindness and deafness, a lot of mental health issues were definitely things that people wanted to try to weed out of the gene pool. And in order to prevent these things from spreading throughout society, many cities and states did begin promoting eugenics laws, okay, meaning laws to restrict who could and could not reproduce in order to try to stop these types of traits from spreading. All right. And so many cities and states began passing mandatory sterilization laws requiring individuals who had certain types of traits to become sterilized, whether it was through a procedure or by taking some kind of contraceptive. Now, again, by our 21st century understanding of the word progressive, this does not meet the format at all, right? This does not look like progress. But we're trying to see that common thread here of what makes a progressive in the progressive era, not the 21st century. The only thing I've seen so far that all these different groups of people we've looked at have in common is they recognize something that they consider to be a problem, and they're calling on government as well as members of their democratic society to address this problem, right? Well, here with eugenics, whether or not we in the 21st century considered these things to be a problem, a lot of people here in this period did consider these issues to be what they saw as a problem, and they called on government to address that problem. I know that really requires a lot of empathy without necessarily having sympathy there. Another key issue that a lot of progressives pushed for was bringing an end to child labor. A lot of progressives thought that being stuck in industrial jobs limited children's opportunities in their future life, and they wanted them instead to become educated contributors to society with more opportunities. And they very successfully pushed for government to act on this. All right, they had some successful legislation passed on behalf of child labor restrictions. There was, for example, a federal law passed known as the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act. So the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act stated that any company using child labor could not operate across state lines. And big business was not happy about this. They liked having kids that they could employ for cheap. Uh, so they really challenged this. They put up a lot of resistance to this Keating-Owen Child Labor Act, and they tried to say that it was unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court agreed with them. All right. This Keating-Owen Child Labor Act was deemed unconstitutional because they said that government could not interfere with states' rights to allow child labor within specific states. However, it was very significant. Okay, it certainly led to continued legal fights against child labor, and was eventually ended in the 1930s by a law known as the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, this is, of course, after the progressive era, but very much something that was rooted in the struggles that many progressives pushed for during this period. Another prominent goal that a lot of progressives pushed for was this issue of temperance or prohibition. Those were actually two different words. Temperance means limiting the consumption of alcohol and access to alcohol, where prohibition means downright ending access to alcohol and consumption of alcohol. But those terms have kind of been used interchangeably throughout American history. And many progressives did argue against Americans' access to and consumption of alcohol. And they argued that alcohol caused a lot of problems and increased likelihood of domestic violence. We need to understand that, as one of my great wise mentors used to always say, in the 19th century, I quote, Americans drink like fucking fish. All right. End quote. And they're suggesting that this is causing a lot of problems that are occurring in society, things like domestic violence, things like workplace accidents. I do want to point out that domestic violence, while it certainly does get enhanced by things like alcohol and drugs, does not depend on those, and it can exist in all different forms. Okay, it's not always man on woman. There's domestic violence of all kinds, right? There's adult on children, adult on elderly. There's woman on man, woman on woman, man on man. All kinds of domestic violence exists, both with and without the use of drugs and slash or alcohol. It's okay, just to clear that up. And I also want to clarify that if anybody is going through or aware of any type of abuse, please speak up on that. Nobody needs to be taking that kind of shit. Regardless, I digress a bit there. Many progressives were arguing that alcohol was the root of a lot of these social problems. So many of them began holding rallies and lobbying for laws to restrict alcohol sales. Again, they're recognizing what they consider to be a problem in society, and they're calling on members of their democratic society to get involved with pushing for government to address this issue. This movement was largely led by women. Remember, a lot of them are pushing this idea that men are coming home drunk, beating their wives, and that men are now unable to work to their full potential because they're going to work drunk, and it's causing workplace accidents. And then that's also leaving them out of work and making them unable to provide for their families. So a lot of it is women pushing for this temperance or prohibition. And they formed organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, as well as the Anti Saloon League. And these organizations would push for people to take the pledge, meaning make this public statement that they would pledge to stop drinking. They'd hold rallies, lobby the government, petition government. Again, they're pushing for government to make this change here. But another very effective tactic that a lot of women would collectively agree to were to go on sex strikes, meaning they would refuse to engage in any kind of schooly pooping, any kind of affectionate activity, even kissing in some cases, or hugging, any kind of affection toward the men in their lives, unless those men agreed to take the pledge or to show some kind of support for their movement. Now, that to me sounds like its own form of domestic abuse, but I'm not going to go there. And these movements were largely successful, all right, at the state and local level. They started getting dry towns, dry counties to forbid the sale of alcohols in those certain areas. Some progressives who pushed for temperance took more radical, extreme approaches toward getting their message across. Good example here would be Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation with this little old hatchet-wielding lady who believed that God had called on her to go on a mission. And she would show up in towns with this hatchet in one hand and a Bible in the other to carry out her mission. Her mission was smashing up bars and destroying alcohol barrels and bottles to convince people to take that pledge and to stop drinking that demon rum that was so polluting their souls in her eyes. God, this always cracks me up. I couldn't imagine just chilling at a bar having a drink, and then here comes this little old lady yelling at you about what a sinner you are for drinking that demon rum, and then taking your bottle out of your hand and smashing it against the wall, and smashing her hatchet all over the place while yelling Bible verses at you. Just sounds like a total trip. But she was frequently arrested also for doing things like property damage, trespassing into bars where she wasn't welcome, etc. And she would raise funds to pay off her legal fees by holding rallies where she would promote things like temperance. And at those rallies, she would sell her signature hatchet. So we can see she's a pretty clear example of progressives who push for temperance in very radical ways, right? As you might imagine, though, there was a lot of resistance to these progressives who pushed for temperance and prohibition. If I was alive in the progressive era, you would most likely see me marching alongside these guys here. We've seen that a lot of people really heavily involved in this progressive movement. People like Jane Addams and Carrie Nation were women, right? Women had been very heavily involved in all different forms of American politics since the dawn of the United States, all right? Women were very heavily involved in a lot of ways, both directly and indirectly, starting with the American Revolution. And that hasn't changed up to this point. Yet women have been denied being able to participate in electoral politics, right? Because they've been denied something as simple as having the right to vote. And that's something that a lot of progressives also pushed for, was women's suffrage, okay? Many of these progressive women were saying, we're starting these organizations, we're petitioning the government, we are clearly capable of political action and thought. So stop playing games with us and give us the right to vote, right? And different progressive women, we need to understand, would take different approaches toward pushing for that right to vote. We also need to understand that different progressive women had different motivations for pushing for that right to vote, right? So what I want to look at here is a couple of examples. So one type of woman we see pushing for women's suffrage during the progressive era was Carrie Chapman Catt. Now, I know we just talked about another Carrie, don't get them mixed up. Easy way to think about it, you look at this lady, she looks like a nice little cat lady, right? She just wants to be at home, taking care of her home. That says a lot about her. Carrie Nation is trying to carry the nation to reform by smashing things up with a hatchet. A lot more intense, right? But Carrie Chapman Catt advocated women's suffrage in order to strengthen the traditional role of women in American society, taking on that role of being the caretaker of the home and the family. And she's arguing that by having that right to vote, women could better serve in their roles as mothers, as wives, because they could vote for laws that helped support the home. They could help vote for politicians also that help support the home to make them better in their traditional roles in society. All right. So she's an example of that type of progressive woman, calling for women's suffrage as a means to strengthen women's traditional roles in American society. Note that that's key. Don't just tell me she's an example of progressives who push for women's suffrage, because that's only half of it. Why? She's an example of progressive women who push for that right to vote in order to strengthen their traditional roles in American society. By contrast, we saw women like Alice Paul. So women like Alice Paul wanted to use suffrage to challenge women's traditional roles. All right, they saw that right to vote as part of a bigger shift away from being simply wives, mothers, etc., in relation to men, and taking on their own sense of identity. They saw this, in short, as part of a bigger shift toward gender equality. Alice Paul was known to use more radical tactics. So, for example, she was once jailed for picketing a building during a demonstration in which she was promoting women's suffrage. And while she was in jail, she went on a hunger strike. And there's very disturbing firsthand accounts of them having to force feed her with a tube. But we can see, though, that somebody like Alice Paul is a clear example of progressive women who push for that right to vote in order to challenge women's traditional role. All right. So make sure if you're writing about her, you stress that, versus if you're writing about Carrie Chapman Catt here, you stress that she's wanting to strengthen that traditional role. That's the key there. I'm putting them in conversation. I'd like you to do the same. But again, through both women like Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul, we can see that they are recognizing what they consider to be a problem in society. In this case, the problem is women are lacking that right to vote, and they're calling on government to make changes to this by passing laws that will establish that right to vote for women. So now I want to look at some major legal achievements carried out through this progressive era. We've seen some already, right? We've seen things like passage of the FDA. We saw the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act, which unfortunately got declared unconstitutional, but set the foundations for later restrictions to be placed on child labor. But let's look at some other major legal achievements during the progressive era. There were, for example, a series of constitutional amendments passed in this period that I want us to be familiar with. First off, the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment called for what we consider a progressive income tax, in which those with the most amount of income will be taxed the highest, and those with the least amount of income will be taxed the least, and everybody else will fall somewhere in between based on their income. All right. Again, the goal here is to ease the pressures from the poor and ease the pressures on those who are already struggling financially by not adding an extra due burden to them by requiring them to pay as much taxes. This also allows those with excess wealth to help provide for the common good. This is very much a legacy of the Populist Party. Remember, this is something the Populists had directly called for in the Omaha platform. All right, then the 17th Amendment. This amendment called for direct election of senators. So again, the goal here is to try to ease things like political corruption by having this body of government more directly accountable to the people. And this is also, again, a legacy of the Populist Party. This is something directly called for, once again, in the Omaha platform. So the 18th Amendment federally banned transportation, manufacturing, or sale of alcohol throughout the United States. This is a clear response to those pushing for things like temperance and prohibition. And then there was the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment protected the right to vote to all U.S. citizens, regardless of their sex. This is protecting that right to vote for women. Again, this is a direct response to those who had been pushing for women's suffrage throughout the progressive era. So all of these constitutional amendments, 16th through 19th, all seem to be pretty direct responses to the issues that progressives have been raising and pushing for, right? They successfully, in this case, called on the federal government to make long-lasting changes that would implement the reforms they were hoping to see. Another major legal achievement for the progressives was the establishment of the Federal Reserve, which was established through the Federal Reserve Act. The Federal Reserve is an institution that regulates national currency, also regulates banking, and essentially serves as a bank for banks, meaning it supplies other banks with loans. All right. The function of a bank is not simply to hold money, it is to loan money to businesses and to people. And that's how those banks make a profit, right? They're a business and they charge interest on the loans they give out. Well, the Federal Reserve serves as a bank for banks. Okay, it gives out loans to other banks to keep them running as they need it. Federal Reserve also controlled money supply and set standards for bank loans. During the Progressive era, we also saw the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act, which strengthened earlier antitrust legislation like the Sherman Antitrust Act. This act regulated corporations and definitely aimed to reduce trust and monopolies in order to increase competition within the free market of the American economy. All right, so this next topic here will show us the real nuanced nature of the progressives, because we've already seen that some progressives advocated things like eugenics and Jim Crow laws, but there were actually some progressives who did advocate things like minority uplift and civil rights. So I do want to take a look at a few examples of some prominent progressives of color. One we can see is Jovita Idar. Jovita Idar came from a family of Mexican-American progressives in Texas who sought to take action against lynching and segregation, which Mexican Americans faced. This was more of a social discrimination, and it kind of varied from region to region, but it was very prominent throughout the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. Some historians refer to this discrimination as Juan Crow. And her family had this newspaper that they owned and published called La Crónica. And La Crónica tried to raise awareness about these types of issues and tried to advocate for the uplift of Mexican Americans. Please note that this is not the Corpus Christi Chronica. So I don't want to read anything in anybody's exams about the Corpus Christi Chronica. As entertaining as that is, I see enough of that sploop boop on Facebook, okay? So no Corpus Christi Chronica. So Jovita Yadar's first career was as a teacher, and she found herself very frustrated by the poor conditions of Mexican American schools, as well as the poor conditions that several of her students lived in. And it was just a bit too much for her. So she continued to push for improvements for Mexican American education throughout her life, but she ended up moving on with journalism as her primary career. Jovita Yadar also ended up working with her family to found El Primer Congreso Mexicanista, which is the first Mexican Congress. That's an organization that pushed to combat the issues that La Cronica raised awareness about, basically to challenge things like mass segregation and discrimination faced by Mexican Americans and try to improve educational opportunities for Mexican Americans. Overall, they just pushed for Mexican American uplift. And then Jovita Yadar herself helped found La Liga Femenil Mexicanista, which is the League of Mexican Women. All right. And La Liga took on all the same issues as the first Mexican Congress, but they also took on the issue of women's suffrage. All right. And they also provided an array of services to women, including education, clothing, and more. Later in her life, when Jovita Yadar was writing for a newspaper called El Progreso, that's Progresso, Progreso. And in this newspaper, she wrote an article that criticized President Woodrow Wilson's decision to send an expedition down to the Mexican American border during the Mexican Revolution. Jovita herself had served in various ways to support Mexican people during the revolution. She served for a short time as a nurse in Mexico, but she had all kinds of qualms with President Woodrow Wilson's policies regarding the Mexican Revolution, and she made that very well known through her journalism. And in response to this, some Texas Rangers showed up at the El Progreso newspaper company to try to shut her down. And Jovita just kind of stood her ground. She stood there and stared them down, and she refused to back down. And she knew she was taking a big chance. We got to keep in mind this is a woman who grew up with a family who investigated and drew awareness to things like murders of Mexican Americans at the hands frequently of the Texas Rangers. But she stood her ground bravely and refused to back down, and the Texas Rangers wound up leaving. Now, unfortunately, they did come back later that night and destroy the newspaper company. But regardless, it's pretty impressive that Jovita Yadar was willing to demonstrate that bravery and take a chance to stand for what she believed in. There were also some African American progressives. A clear example here would be Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was a woman who took a strong stance against lynching of African Americans. She worked as a muckraker, providing eyewitness accounts and getting secondhand testimonies of the violence that was running rampant in the Jim Crow South. She also worked with W.E.B. Du Bois and others. Remember W.E.B. Du Bois we've seen before. He was the author of Black Reconstruction in America. He also rejected Booker T. Washington's Atlantic Compromise and promoted immediate Black uplift. Well, together with some others, these two individuals founded this National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. This organization aimed to promote African American uplift and racial equality. Okay, their founders were of various races because they were firm advocates of racial equality. They also called very clearly in their founding platform on the federal government to fully and equally enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments. All right, so they were very much carrying through with the unfinished revolution of Reconstruction. The NAACP would also move forward to be the kind of legal wing of the African American civil rights movement. We'll see them come up again as we move forward with African American civil rights after World War II. All right, so in retrospect, we've seen all kinds of things going on here, right? We've seen some people pushing to regulate business, some more concerned with political corruption, others wanting to improve the conditions of urban America. Then we've seen some people pushing for things like eugenics laws, others pushing for civil rights and uplift for minorities. We've seen some people fighting against child labor, some working toward temperance or prohibition. What do they all have in common? All right, what is that common thread that helps us identify what it means to be a progressive in the progressive era? Well, the one thing that all these individuals and all these organizations have in common, despite their many differences, is that they all recognize some kind of perceived problem in society or in the wider world, and they see government as an institution that could and should solve that problem. All right, I'm going to say that again. These are individuals who recognize perceived problems either in society or in the wider world, and they view government as an institution who could and should address those problems. All right, so really, what makes a progressive in this era is being an individual who views government as having a sort of responsibility as well as potential to work on behalf of solving perceived problems. Okay, keep that in mind moving forward. I know we covered a lot here. You have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, that's it for now. Over and out.